So good morning for those who are on the East Coast. Good afternoon for those who are in Europe or the Middle East or Africa or other parts of the world. Again, my name is Dina Sherif. I'm the Executive Director of the MIT Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship. For those of you who don't know us, we were established over 12 years ago to promote and think about how entrepreneurship is a critical pathway to prosperity and sustainable development, specifically within emerging markets. We're very excited today to have an amazing group of speakers. I personally am a little intimidated as I was going through all of their bios, very specialized trade experts. And I think this is, as I was telling the speakers right before we started, for the Legatum Center, this is a very special webinar because it is very specialized in thinking about trade and why trade is important specifically to entrepreneurship and innovation. So we're very excited to delve deeper into this topic of how entrepreneurs can benefit from trade policy, but also how we can all think about what needs to change so that we can see global trade increase and be on the rise again to support economic growth within our countries, specifically emerging markets. So very quickly, I just wanted to introduce our amazing group of panelists. We have Abla Adel-Latif, who is the Executive Director of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. She's also a very dear friend of mine. We're both Egyptian, but also she and I have also served on a special counsel to the President of Egypt on economic development, but she's been an integral part of developing economic policy, specifically in the area of trade for Egypt for many, many years. We have Shanker Singham, who's the chairman of the Global Economic Neural Network, who's a trade and competitiveness lawyer with a lot of experience in public policy. He spent a lot of time writing many special pieces specifically on prosperity zones. We're very eager to hear from him. We have Lars Karlsson, who's president and CEO of KGH Border Services, who, from what I gathered from your bio, is very specialized in customs. And then last but not least, we have Daniel Gottschald, I hope I pronounced that well, who's the managing director of TUM International. And also, I'm specifically interested and excited because you're very specialized in clusters. And if there is anything I do understand about trade, clusters will definitely help that. So thank you all for being here again. I ask all of you in the audience to please type in your questions as we go along in the Q&A box. We will spend about 30 minutes I'll spend about 30 minutes asking the panelists questions, and then I'll invite questions from all of you. So please type them in as we go along, and we'll get to them in the second half of the session. So Dr. Abla, I wanted to start with you to really provide more of an overview for the conversation. You and I have been working on this idea of promoting entrepreneurship as a pathway to economic growth in Egypt for several years now. What are some of the obstacles and barriers to growing a business that entrepreneurs face in countries like Egypt and emerging markets more broadly?
Yes, Dina. Hello, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. The problems that are faced by entrepreneurs and by startups actually are more or less the same in all countries in the world, but we see stronger features in developing countries, Egypt being one of them. The time that's required to start a business in the country, the ease of doing business, the procedures that you have to go through in order to start a business, the cost of starting the business. Okay, all of these are obstacles that they face. When you talk entrepreneurship, you take it one step back and you talk about ideation, okay? Even starting with the idea of the project and how this idea, in order to materialize, it needs angel investment, and later on it needs venture capital and so on. This part is entirely weak in our countries because our financial support is mainly focused on giving loans to the projects, which is a bit too early. When you talk about entrepreneurs, they need different kind of financing. These are some of the obstacles, and the solution to that is actually the solution to all kind of business and all kinds of investment, improving the doing business environment, and having governance, having competitive markets, et cetera, et cetera. The same conditions that apply to all investment are the ones that will help the entrepreneurs, plus the financial element that is especially categorized in their case.
So Dr. Abla, just as a follow-up question, and I was saying this earlier before the session began, entrepreneurs don't really speak much, or we don't really speak to entrepreneurs very much about trade. We don't really talk to them about how they can engage with trade policy or think about being a part of a free trade zone. What kind of opportunities exist for entrepreneurs to benefit from trade policy, but also how should entrepreneurs be promoting better trade policy that serves them?
Okay, let me take your question to its most basic level, really. Okay, and in order to answer, I think it's important that we divide entrepreneurs into two types. Okay, the ones that are just, you know, the regular project, the simple projects, any new project, any startup, and the ones that are potential unicorns. Okay, the entrepreneurship on that side, because the effect of trade is different on these two sides. When we talk about trade, and I'm not going to talk about trade policy as such, I'm going to talk about trade itself, and the policies actually emerge from that automatically. Trade benefits entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs can benefit trade, especially following COVID-19. Trade benefits entrepreneur because trading, being able to sell your product, is actually part of the cycle, part of the business cycle. If you cannot sell your product, then you cannot go anywhere, you are doomed, okay? And we don't talk about it because we always seem to assume that it's going to happen anyway, when actually the problem is that it doesn't always happen. Okay? And the best way to show the impact of trade on entrepreneurs, I'm going to give it with a very, very brief example, and it's a local one. Okay? For an entrepreneur in Egypt, that's called your job next to your home. Okay? Factories that were actually created in villages very close to the places where people live. A new project, all right? But the beauty of this model is that it started with the trade part before the project itself. The entrepreneurs made arrangements with the big companies to buy their products, and on the basis of this agreement, they built the entire business model. So it succeeded because of the guarantee of trade in advance. And it had a very, very nice impact on the employment of women, on saving on transportation costs, et cetera, on cutting unemployment in the countryside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Without getting into its details, I'm just saying that the starting point was the trade arrangement, okay? And it's domestic.
The success of that project was built around making everyone very aware of the opportunities that they would have for trade if they built their businesses there.
Yes, and not only aware, actually arranging these first and then building the project accordingly, which is completely new, because usually you go for the project and then you search for the market accordingly. Here you guarantee the market. They got their loans from the banks on the basis of the market that they had. Okay, so this is one type. When you look at the other type, and we talk about how entrepreneurship can affect trade, here we have to remind ourselves that a significant part of world trade is in trade in services. And it's on the increase, and on significant increase. And the trade in services benefits a lot from the technology, and it's being digitized. And a lot of innovative entrepreneurship is emerging in that specific area, okay? More services that are happening, e-commerce is one of them, more services that are happening online, more trade that is happening online. Now, when you think post-COVID-19, okay, obviously COVID-19, what it did is make our life online, and no wonder we're talking this way right now. So all of the transactions are taking place online, and therefore entrepreneurs are coming up on daily basis with innovative ideas that actually improve the chances of the regular trade. And again, to give you an example here, and it tells it all, there's a very big exhibition of ready-made garments that takes place in Egypt on regular basis, yearly basis. It's called Destination Africa. Usually there is a time when they come and there are booths and there are, you know, products that are being shown. All of this is going to happen this year completely online, okay? Completely online through platforms that arranged, transformed, moved an exhibition that naturally has to happen in a physical way. You have to come in, you have to touch products, the buyers have to meet the sellers and all this stuff. It's doing it completely online. So here, entrepreneurship and innovative ways of thinking of trade has actually managed to save an exhibition that was happening on a yearly basis, promoting global trade, particularly within Africa, linking Europe to Africa, linking the US to Africa.
Yeah.
It's happening on a yearly basis. Now it's going to happen completely online, thanks to innovative entrepreneurship.
That is amazing. And also recognizing the importance of not seeing trade decline specifically in Africa. Shanker, I wanted to move to you. The Global Economic Neural Network, you recently wrote a paper that really went into great detail about prosperity zones and what distinguishes prosperity zones from special economic zones and other types of free trade zones, right? And you and I met recently, well, I guess really right before COVID happened in London. And we talked a little bit about the importance of these zones to promoting innovation and entrepreneurship within emerging markets. Can you, for the audience, really break down a little bit? Well, it would be great if you could introduce the network and explain what that is for the audience, but also could you break down and explain what exactly is a prosperity zone and how do you differentiate that from other zones? And why should entrepreneurs be making use of these zones?
Well, thanks very much, Dina, and pleasure to have my co-authors of the report that Jen produced, with me today. Jen, Global Economic Neural Network, which is the sort of project, I suppose it is, that I chair. I mean, why is it described that way? I think we've recognized that the world sort of consists ever more of nodes and networks in global supply chains, and entrepreneurs, every entrepreneur is in a supply chain. They may not know they're in a global supply chain, but at some point their products feed into things that are used by others, and so they're all part of this sort of great web of international trade around the world. And what we were seeing is a handful of zones, cities, zones, regional zones that were becoming nodes on this set of global supply chains with trade superhighways almost between them. And the challenge for countries was one of relevance. Do I have as a country those kinds of nodes and networks that attract global capital, which moves at lightning pace? So that I can create economic output and economic value and jobs and all these other things. And there was a difference developing, a sort of Premier League, if you will, of nodes and nodes that were developing around the world. And the question is, how do countries, particularly emerging markets, sort of plug into this reality? And we call it a neural network because global trade is very, very difficult to model the impact of these things around the world, because it's really more like a complex biological system than it is a sort of something that's easy to model. So that's why we gave it that name. But the report really talked about as we come out of the COVID economic crisis, we really need to accelerate private sector economic growth, because governments are going to be, because of the responses to COVID, are going to be massively indebted, have unsustainable levels of debt, because essentially they've been employing whole workforces during the COVID period. How are we going to generate economic output? And I think what we're going to see, pandemics always accelerate pre-existing trends. So we're engaged in a trend now in terms of how most of our lives, our business lives, have moved onto the virtual environment. A lot of that's not going to change when we come out of COVID. We're not suddenly going to junk all these platforms and go back to meeting. We will go to meetings for some of the time, some of the things that we need to do, but we'll use these kinds of technologies going forward anyway. And so one of these trends that was occurring beforehand that's going to be accelerated is this trend of nodes and networks and increasing entrepôts and places that will take a sort of preeminent role in global trade. And we will also need to have more visibility into our supply chains. COVID has taught us that we didn't really have a lot of visibility into supply chains. They weren't very resilient. That's all going to have to change. And so I think we're going to see more of that. Now, some of the things that Dr. Abla was talking about in terms of entrepreneurial challenges can be dealt with in this new environment, because what we're essentially saying in the report is, if you look at what generates economic activity, what is it? We all know, what these things are. It's an open trading environment, it's competitive markets, it's a regulatory system that promotes economic output and economic growth, and in particular for entrepreneurs, it's a regulatory system that is not skewed in favor of incumbent companies, that allows new market entrants to have a fair shake. And so knowing that that's what actually generates economic growth and economic activity, the question is, how do you put these two big trends together? And what we're seeing and that's where the prosperity zone comes into play, because what we're seeing is, if you can put these big trends together, and if you can create in a country a zone which is based on the typical free trade zone, the typical special economic zone, in terms of trade liberal environment, in terms of exemptions on tariffs and customs and so forth, but builds on top of that a layer of regulatory improvements, which is the key to attracting global capital and attracting investment, so that anybody, whether they're an entrepreneur or just any business, knows that in that particular environment, the quality of their work is going to be ultimately the determinant of their success, and it isn't going to be reliance on a regulatory bias in favor of a particular company or anything like that. Then they're going to go to these places. They're going to invest in these places, and then you're going to get this virtuous circle developed of zones that have these enormous impacts, and we've seen a lot of them. There are some big famous ones that are hundreds of years old, even 1,000 years old. So places like the City of London and New York and so on, and then we have newer cities that have become, have used different regulatory environments to improve themselves. So we think of places like Singapore and the UAE and so forth.
So Shanker, can I interrupt you for just a second, just because I think that point is really important, because what you're the idea of good regulation being very important to the success of these types of zones or nodes is critical, specifically in an emerging market context, right? So the City of London or Singapore, they're in very different places than some cities in Africa, some cities in Southeast Asia or Latin America. It would be really good if you could break down for the audience, and also I would love for other panelists to jump in too. If I'm an entrepreneur and I know that these zones are going to be good for my business, but perhaps the regulatory environment and policy is not where it should be, what should I be asking from the government in terms of good regulation to help my business grow and to help me benefit from these zones?
Yeah, there's one level that Dr. Abla talked about in terms of ease of doing business and things that are typically in, for example, the World Bank Doing Business Index. How long does it take to set up a business? How long does it take to establish these norms? What's the cost of doing business? What's the cost of the whole insolvency area, for example? So there's a range of things that are sort of top level things, but I think you need to look at the prosperity zone as a solution to a problem. And what is the problem? The problem is a regulatory environment in many emerging markets which doesn't create those conditions for economic output and economic growth and for entrepreneurs. And there's a level below the sort of doing business stuff that some of these zones also need to deal with. And I'll give you a couple of examples, because I gave you London and Singapore and UAE, which are a different category, although I would say the learning from Singapore and UAE is you can build something in 30, 40 years, actually, that suddenly becomes a rival to cities that have been around for hundreds of years. So that's an interesting
Right.
thing.
Only at this current
But,
time, we don't have 30 or 40 years. So how do we expedite?
well, exactly. So if I give you two examples, one is a zone in Oman, the special economic zone at Duqm, where they've literally identified what are the barriers that businesses face in doing business in Oman. So there's the two that they focused on. One was local distribution laws that gave enormous protection to the local distributor class, made it very difficult for multinationals or foreign companies to trade in that country. So they've eliminated that law just for the zone, not for the whole country, because it would be very difficult to push against the powerful vested interests that benefit from that law. But in the zone, they've managed to eliminate that law. They've also lowered the requirement, the so-called Omanization requirement, the requirement that you have to have a certain percentage of Omani workers in your workforce, from 35% to 10%. And what that does, that has been a historic barrier for trade and investment, and not only foreign investment, but also domestic investment. So there are these tweaks that you can make based on the problems that you have. In Panama, there's a zone called Panama Pacifico, which has dealt with the issue of business travel, business visas for business travel. And it's opened that category out considerably in the zone. So it can really take advantage of the financial service component that Panama offers, because you've got to move, increasingly in the international, trading world, you've got to move brains. It's not just a question of moving capital and moving trade and services and so on. You've actually got to move people. You've got to move brains. You've got to make these places attractive places for people to live. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, the big impediment to that is often the business visa approach, and we talk in the report about opening up business corridors as well. I mean, we need out of COVID to open up these business corridors. A lot of countries have quarantine rules. The UK has a quarantine rule that basically makes it impossible for somebody to come. So Panama Pacifico deals with those issues. You can deal with planning issues. I mean, many countries it takes an awfully long time to plan anything. You can experiment with regulatory sandboxes. Try to see how things can be made better. So basically, what you do is you look at all those things that would be very difficult to do at a national level, and you do them at a zone level, and it becomes a demonstration model of success. And when you've got a demonstration model of success, the rest of the country can say, you know what, that really worked. And it wasn't Silicon Valley, it wasn't London, it was here, it was right here in our country.
Right. And
maybe it's the regulatory environment that means that has led to the success, and maybe we should copy it.
Yeah, I'm going to bring your co-author in. Daniel, I've always been fascinated with the idea of clusters and how clusters can be used to support the overall development and growth of sectors. And when someone starts a business, when an entrepreneur starts a business, the extent to which they can benefit from the cluster model is quite massive. And I think there have been examples of how these zones can be really great places to develop clusters. I'd love to hear for you to share with the audience, what does a cluster model entail, and why does it work so well within these zones?
Yeah, I'll be happy to comment on that. So the clusters we like are natural phenomena. They are not artificial systems. They exist very often for decades or even for more than 100 years, while special economic zones usually have been created by a governmental decree or by a certain economic policy. So in the past, in most cases, special economic zones were mainly focusing on foreign direct investment, bring multinationals to the country, upgrade your own economy. So in many cases, these special economic zones were somehow disconnected from the real domestic economy, which means that the local cluster communities, even if they may be small, even if they may be just a nucleus of a few companies working together, knowing each other, did not really benefit from these special economic zones.
Can you give an example of what a good cluster community is?
Well, I mean, we have these.
And Dr. Abla, I will come back to you.
We have these cluster studies of Michael Porter. So what you actually want to have is an ecosystem with its own dynamic. You have big and small companies. They are gathered along one value chain. They benefit from each other. Some of them may be competing, but still they have something like a system approach. Together they are stronger on the market than they would be alone. And these clusters can be stimulated by giving them a very smart governance. Cluster management, organizations, doers, caretakers who bring these companies together. That is very hands-on work on the ground. It's
in building comparative advantage.
Definitely, it can be a strong competitive advantage. It can reduce your R&D costs by far. It can help you to find new customers. There are many, many examples. Yeah. However, a special economic zone usually was not the place for these types of clusters to grow. This was rather a traditional place where you have been living for a long time. Your friends are there, so it's an organic growth of a cluster. Now, prosperity zones, they will be a different approach because prosperity zones do not only have this inbound vision of attracting foreign direct investment, but they also have an outbound perspective. They will allow local cluster communities to have more access to world markets, to world supply chains, and to other special economic zones. So that is what we would love to see. If you are a local entrepreneur in an emerging market, you should have something like a factory of the future, a sandbox where you have a fast track towards future project development. You have a hub where you can present your product, your knowledge, and you can interact with the global cluster community. We are going to see definitely much more interconnected special economic zones, corridors between special economic zones in Europe and in the US and in Middle East and elsewhere. So as an entrepreneur, you can find your optimized position within these global corridors. You can make proposals, you can have crazy ideas and you present them on that platform, but you don't have to relocate. And you don't have to deal with people who just ask you how much will you invest, how many millions of investment will you bring our country, but you can use it as a global playground. If
so these special economic zones could actually be a tool for entrepreneurs to use to scale their businesses cross borders.
Definitely, they can, the special economic zones, or let's then rather talk of prosperity zones, they can be customer for local SME, local entrepreneurs, because you provide services to them, you use them as a platform to promote your products or services, but they can definitely also help you to accelerate, upgrade your own business development if you are a local company. I strongly believe in that.
Yeah, fantastic. Lars, I really want to move to you, and then Dr. Abla, I'm going to come back to you to summarize a little bit of everything that has been said, specifically bringing it down to what is happening in reality within countries in Africa. Lars, I think, you know, oftentimes when we think about the technology and innovation space and businesses that are starting there, when you talk to them about a free trade zone, there's almost an automatic disconnect, right? Because we often equate these zones with manufacturing and industry, like a little bit like Dr. Abla was talking about factories. But it would be good for the audience to hear a little bit from you. What kind of industries can really thrive in these zones? And what do you think the future is going to hold in a post-COVID world for some of the new sectors that are emerging, especially in light of what Dr. Abla started her comments with, which is that services and trade in services and technology is on the rise, but that really doesn't involve building a factory in a special zone.
No, that's correct. Thank you very much for the question and for having us here on this specific discussion. Very important discussion and dialogue, I think. Let me, before I get exactly into your the answer to your question, say that one of the issues that we've been, and also Shanker and Daniel has talked about, is that we do see a paradigm shift around zones right now, and that's why we also have mentioned them as prosperity zones. Because when you, exactly what you were saying, when you see free ports or free zones, they're attached to a history here, or what we used them for before, which might be manufacturing or repackaging or wherever it might be. And in those specific circumstances, one of the breaks of becoming what they should be was actually regulatory frameworks around them. So for a customs guy like me, free zones and free ports was always a problem, because it's per definition outside the customs territory and customs unions and others, which means that there were no transparency and good governance, which created also problems in zones like this. So we have 3,000 zones or more that are definitely not the same thing. They are doing very much different things. Free ports, free zones, special economic zones, and so forth. And what we see now is a change, a paradigm change, because the last 10 years, of course, the international supply chain and global value chains have become extremely more integrated. That is why Brexit becomes a problem. That is why we see this protectionism is not working very well, because again, it's integrated supply chains and value chains. And all of the other supply chain stakeholders have actually upgraded themselves to be more transparent, to take a bigger security and safety responsibility. Without the zones haven't done that until now. So the last 2-3 years, we've seen a big change where there are voluntary compliance programs like the Safe Zone from World Free Zone Organization, like the OECD Clean Zone, like the World Customs Organization's Authorized Economic Operators. And when zones then move to that level, then there's a totally different way of looking at the zones themselves and what they actually can do and what we can build within those zones. And that is why it's opening up what Daniel and Shanker was talking about before. What type of industries is now interesting to have in there? How do you connect it with the local community and the network and the clusters that are outside the zone? So what we see with the prosperity zones is also working together with the agencies of that country to actually make it easier to get in and out of the zone, to use the dynamism of the zone that is more than only repackaging or producing something, but it's a cluster of competence. There's a university or two linked into it for workforce. There's small and medium-sized companies that can be in the zone or outside the zone, but still be subcontractors to the companies in the zone. And you create an environment that is good for innovation, that is good for growth, that is good for any type of connection also between, again, as Dr. Abla said, services and goods, which is the big new thing that we will have to address also from a government and customs perspective in the future. So the interesting thing here is that basically you could say all these future areas of development when it comes to products could actually be very much using a prosperity zone in this way I've just explained and Daniel talked about before. And the good news is that it's actually over the last 15 years, the emerging economies who actually have taken the special economic zones to the higher level than actually the developed world. So the zones in Colombia, or the zones in Africa, or the zones in some parts of Asia is much more developed, but they have still hit also the surface of regulatory connections and regulatory reform, which means that if governments are not then opening up so they can take the next step and connect with other special economic zones and create those trusted trade lanes, trade superhighways we're talking about between these zones, then of course you have already done what you can in that special economic zone or that free zone or that free port. But going to this next level where there's also regulatory reform, which we now see is happening because those who are in those zones can have some of the regulatory self-assessment themselves through these international programs, connect to the supply chain, connect to the global value chains in a much better way. That will open up some of the bottlenecks we've had in Africa, or some of the bottlenecks we had in some parts of emerging economies, where it's extremely difficult to move goods actually outside the own continent, and there's too little of trade between the neighboring countries. And I think that this is exactly where these nodes and engines can take a new leap. And it's because we also have looked at the regulatory framework.
Right. So there are a number of questions from the audience that I'll actually ask now because it's relevant to what you, Daniel, and Lars have said. And that's specifically, what is a special economic zone in the digital economy, and what would be a cluster? What would a cluster look like for the digital economy?
Perhaps I may give a first comment on that. I've seen these questions. The simple answer would be a cluster in the digital economy is still the same than in the analog economy, because we are humans, we are social and physical beings. We will always need physical infrastructure. We want to have a real lunch. We don't want to meet for an e-lunch. We want to go on holiday. We have to produce concrete things, so we always need physical places, sites, ecosystems where something is being produced. However, the digital economy gives us much, much more opportunities. And when you talk about the second part of the question, what is a special economic zone in a digitalized world? It's exactly what we have been talking about. It allows us to interconnect these different zones, to break down certain barriers and to give companies the opportunity to benefit much more easily from markets that are at other places, by product development, by design, by offering their services. So it's definitely a more cyber-physical system that we are going to set up. You need a home. You need a place where you feel at home. You need to watch out your window and see your own trees and your own birds singing in these trees. But digitalization allows you to bring the whole world to that place, to interact, to communicate, driven by new technologies. That is a topic that Lars probably can address much better.
Thank you, Daniel. Dr. Abla, I know that you wanted to perhaps summarize all these comments a little bit and really qualify what you heard with regards to prosperity zones. So I wanted to give you a chance to comment, and then I would like to see if we can humanize a little bit these zones and talk a little bit about human capital and how we can make these zones more inclusive. So Dr. Abla.
Yes, thank you, Dina. I just have a few very brief comments, and let me start with the question that you had. How do the clusters look in the digital economy? The platforms that exist digitally are actually clusters, are actually arrangements of people that are working together, and their work is being organized through the platform, so it is there. But actually my comment has to do with the prosperity zones. I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about entrepreneurs and prosperity zones. Prosperity zones, as described, are like the special economic zones where there are advantages, conditions that do not exist in the rest of the country, regulatory conditions, tax conditions, etc., in order to improve the business environment. The prosperity zones apply to all investors, okay, all business people. Linking it and talking about entrepreneurs is a bit dangerous, because entrepreneurship involves this first stage where the project is like a baby, all right? The project is being created. When it reaches the stage of being a startup with a market, an established market share, being in the prosperity zone is going to give it room to scale up and increase. And you go beyond the zone in the case of the potential unicorns, for instance, where the market for one country is not even big enough, like in the case of Uber or something. You need to go across countries and facilitate trade relations across countries. So I think it's very important that we don't restrict it to entrepreneurship, because it's just for all business. It's good, but it's for all businesses. If you are talking about entrepreneurship specifically, you would need to have incubators inside those special economic zones or prosperity zones. Because what the incubator does is give exactly what those babies need: centralized services, technical support for the ideation, the special type of financing, okay? This is very special to entrepreneurs. If it comes inside those zones, so it's like the baby school, the nursery, and when they get out of it, they get into big school, which is a clean one and a good one that has all the governance things. The comments by Mr. Lars on the value chain. What happened after COVID-19 is that all the value chains are coming actually closer to home. So we need to revisit when we talk about prosperity zones. Are we talking about zones just inside the country, or are we talking about zones that link up to the other countries as well and link up to the outside world? The things are different now. So I don't think special economic zones with big advantages would be enough. We need to go beyond that. Just like when we talk about clusters, we need also industrial policy. It's not enough to have just the zone. there is industrial policy that links up things and that sees the clusters that lead to good performance. They're just, you know, quick comments.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. And I will give all of you a little time to comment at the very end, but I wanted to bring in a couple of questions from the audience that are coming in. So one question actually from my brother, my older brother. Larger companies are now trying to make their supply chains more resilient in the shadow of COVID, while at the same time are increasingly using the venture approach to work with entrepreneurs. How can these organizations work together to create an organic and adaptive economic cluster to increase competitiveness for both? Who would like to take on that question?
Great, I can have a go at the go at it. I think, and just to reflect back on what Dr. Abla just said as well, because it's connected to the question, is the point about the regulatory environments that we're talking about in these zones is that they create the conditions where an entrepreneur or a business or an investor or a trader can succeed. That does not mean that the entrepreneur or the trader will succeed. It just creates conditions whereby that can actually happen. And when you create those conditions, then a lot of these relationships, the scale up that we talked about with entrepreneurs, the ability of entrepreneurs to form relationships with larger companies, to integrate more properly into the global supply chain, all of that opens up if you sort of fix these issues. Whereas if you have a regulatory environment that's anti-competitive, that's very much skewed in favor of large incumbent companies, then none of those transactions, none of those value chains coming together can actually occur, and you won't get the environment which creates a demand for the kind of problem-solving skills that entrepreneurs can bring to the table. So that's what I think. Again, it comes back down to that kind of regulatory environment that would prevail.
I can answer. Oh, sorry. Go ahead then. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Just a quick comment. Definitely what we call Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, will help these approaches and pushes them a lot, because today we have opportunities to interact directly with factories, production centers, which are at the other end of the world. So if you are in a place, you have a corresponding production area somewhere in Australia or I don't know where, and you see a certain need for feedstock or whatsoever, which you may need next month, you can more or less in real time communicate with supply hubs all around the world, gather prices, establish something like big clearing houses, compare, building communities of buyers, you can negotiate. So I would say that by applying this Industry 4.0, new digitalization technologies in the future, special economic zones, prosperity zones themselves will become proactive economic actors on the market and trying to optimize the access to global supply chains for their tenants, because it makes them more attractive and more competitive. I definitely think we will see examples like that in the future.
Let me try to answer your brother's questions from a very specific angle, and it's a good question. All of these guys are trying to work together, the big companies, the small ones. In post-COVID, there is a lot of awareness for everybody's existence, and they cannot exist individually. They all need to exist together. One thing that's starting to emerge, okay, it started before COVID, but starting to be a lot stronger, and it involves collaboration from all, is what's called ethical brands. You're starting to see brands, okay, if we take again the ready-made garment as an example, you're starting to see new brands, okay, that are trying to respect people, have small new companies working, having good working environment associated, again, all associated with the big companies, but in a good working environment, good conditions, where the poor are respected, where societies are respected. I think this is the type of framework that could guide a little bit the collaboration between the big and the small and the entrepreneurs in a new environment where everybody has seen that none of them can exist without the other. It's a very specific angle, but I think it touches upon the spirit of the question.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. Another question we have is, how can you create these prosperity zones by anchoring on a small set of firms, mostly specialized in some industries, but with still limited connectedness to global trade and services? So I think the question is really thinking about how can you, if you're anchoring it with a small set of firms who aren't well connected to global trade and services, how can you build these prosperity zones?
I might just start, and my colleagues might bring in some other views as well. But I think that one of the things we have certainly seen is the fact that these special economic zones that are there today, of course, they are limited. Either you have a special economic zone which has connection with that, or it's something that is there for developing the local economy. And what we are seeing with prosperity zones is the fact that if you can bring down with the digital economy today and with the support that needs to be there, right? It is incubation in one way for small and in entrepreneurs, and it's other types of support for bigger companies, connecting them together. Can we bring down, then it becomes easier to get into the international supply chains, even for small and medium-sized companies, because these zones themselves, meeting this requirement we're talking about, will be connected to these bigger chains. That is driven, and I agree with Dr. Abla on that, that predictability, compliance, and different types of more certainty in the supply chains is a direct result of the pandemic we see right now. People want to know what happened and are prepared to pay for that, because the cost in the other end is much bigger if you can't handle the supply chains anymore. The interesting thing is that we need to make sure that these superhighways or thirsty trade lanes does have inclusiveness. And my point is that I think that if we use the zones as prosperity zones, there are more developing countries that could join that type of network, and small specific entrepreneurs, small specific companies can then be connected to the zones, giving that support to actually access the trade networks more easily than we can today, which is more or less using the zones also to build our economies. But the walls from the zones out to the national economy, or the walls into the international supply chain, we haven't solved yet. And that is what the prosperity zones actually do.
So Lars, this is just following up a little bit on Dr. Abla's comments and your comments now. And the question I have for all of you is, I oftentimes see these zones being created outside of urban centers, sometimes in urban centers, but oftentimes in more remote areas. How do we guarantee, because we also know that the success of these zones, just like good regulation is important, just as seeing businesses base themselves there is important, and just as we know that building clusters there are also important. Access to human capital is also important, and that is also not often there. So how do we solve for that problem? But also, how do we ensure that in building these zones, we also are very mindful of things like gender inclusivity and diversity within these zones? And I'd love for Dr. Abla to comment on that, because I know she's thought very carefully about how to attract specifically women entrepreneurs to benefit from some of the incentives of these zones. So how do we ensure that? And how do we ensure that within these zones, we're also guaranteeing that we continue to support global standards in responsible business practice as these zones develop and grow? Shanker, do you want to go first, and then we'll switch to Dr. Abla?
Yeah, sure. I think the point you made at the end about ensuring the sort of standards in zones. I mean, one of the problems for the previous iteration, if you will, of free trade zones and special economic zones, as Lars, knows about more than most, is the fact that we didn't have visibility into them, and that that was not only in terms of all kinds of things: illicit trade, intellectual property violations, all sorts of things, not just ethical business and those sorts of things. But there have, as a result, and he mentioned the safe zone concept, there are mechanisms, there are ways of ensuring that we have greater visibility into the zones. So that is something that is going to come out in the future. I think we also need to think about the regionalization aspects of this that Dr. Abla mentioned. That is absolutely happening, but it does give an opportunity for emerging markets, I think, with some of these zones to integrate better into the sort of overall global supply chain in ways that they may not have done so easily in the past. So I think that's also an important element of what is happening here.
Dr. Abla, I'd love for you to comment on the gender sensitivity aspect. For decades, trade policy has not been gender sensitive and hasn't necessarily been very mindful of the gender inclusivity aspect. What would be your thoughts on that specifically as we think about the need to, how we can use trade in these zones to really promote women entrepreneurs as well?
Okay, thank you, Dina. Let me just say first that talent and human capital are definitely key to any kind of innovation and entrepreneurship. And again, the idea is not about having those specific zones, but having the conditions that would let you reach the talent. Okay, it does not have to be the zones. It's the conditions and the terms of the zones that need to exist. I think this is more important than keeping it to a specific zone. These are things that have to apply to the entire country if possible. But yes, if you are established zones, you would want them to be close to the areas that are heavily populated, okay, far from the big cities, because these are people who need to work and who might have talent. You need to discover the talent in an institutionalized way. And create something like the Shenzhen, what they have in China. Shenzhen is becoming a magnet for talent and for all companies. When you talk about women in specific, let me talk about the case of Egypt. Whenever we talk about women, you notice that everything that's being mentioned are problems that are actually related to both sexes. Okay, not only the women, to the men as well. So the question is, what is specific to women, and how can you pay attention to it and include the policies, and I'm going to say economic policies and not just trade policies, okay, so that you would be talking about industrial policy as well. Or in the case of Egypt, for instance, we did a big study on women to see why they do not start businesses, why are they far from this? And we found 4 key factors that are very, very relevant. I think they would be relevant to any developing countries. One of them is the availability of information. Women do not have access to the information for the opportunities that could be available that would help them start a business. Another one has to do with transportation, physical transportation. When roads are bad, transportation is difficult. It's more difficult for women than men, okay? The third one has to do with the technology and availability of good internet, availability of computers. This, and now post-COVID is even more seriously so, is opening huge areas for women in order to work using the computer. And then the last item was exposure, okay? Women who are exposed to experiences of success and of businesses are more likely to start a business. When you look at these 4 items, you can build an entire economic policy, all right, in order to address these, make sure that the information is available, make sure that the technology has better access in these places, etc., etc., etc. So it's the gender element is relevant in that way. Not to talk for too long.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. So we're running out of time, so I wanted to end with one last question. As a beginner in the field of entrepreneurship, how should I learn about these trade regulations, specifically in emerging markets where bureaucracy is deep in the roots? So what would all of you as experts recommend to young entrepreneurs? How can they educate themselves better about regulations in their countries?
I mean, I would say entrepreneurs need to stick to what they do best, which is finding solutions to problems. And what is incredibly helpful is knowing what are the things that get in the way of those solutions. And what I found in my sort of 30 years of advising on international trade is that 9 times out of 10, when a business says to you, and this is not unique to an entrepreneur, it's true of any business, when they say to you, when you ask them the question, what would you like to do here that you can't do? 9 times out of 10, that is a regulatory barrier or a trade barrier or something that governments can do something about, but don't have visibility into what the problem specifically is. So develop what tends to happen, I think, particularly with entrepreneurs, but it's true of businesses in general, is they will hit the roadblock and then they will say, well, the roadblock is set in stone. It cannot change. So I'm going to do a little workaround. And the workaround is costly and the workaround is damaging to their business. And what they need, I think, to understand is actually the roadblock may not be set in stone. These are the issues in international trade that can be, people can benefit from. And I just want to say, I agree with Dr. Abla. This is not, we can get too tied up in the prosperity zone piece of this. It's not about, the zone is just a means to an end. If we could transform the whole world overnight into a pro-competitive market, a property rights protecting, open trading regime, then we'd have massive economic growth and we wouldn't have all these problems. But that is not feasible. And even at a national level, it is very, very difficult to do. There are a lot of vested interests. There is a lot of incumbent power. And that's why this is an alternative delivery mechanism for achieving some of those goals. And if you do it well enough, and it isn't just about a zone in a particular place in the way people think of things geographically, there is the possibility now of virtualizing some of this. But if you think about the City of London, for example, and no one would think of the City of London as a special economic zone or a prosperity zone, but that's exactly what it is. It has regulatory changes, differences from the rest of the country. It still does. It had until 1944 a appointed MP. So in other words, it was very different from the rest of the country. And it had ancient rights and privileges that that even William the Conqueror in 1066 had to take had to deal with. So when we say zone, we need to be quite broad about our interpretation of what that actually means. And then you've got city states like Hong Kong and Singapore and Dubai and so on, where they're able to do some of these things at a quote national level because they are city states. But the most important thing is, and this is true of your question about moving brains, moving people to these areas as well. If you create this kind of environment where they can actually succeed, then people will move there. And in fact, many of these places have almost more in common with each other than they do with the countries in which they are located. And there's a reason for that. It's because they are nodes in a global network, and people move very easily around that global network, and they feel comfortable doing that. That's why coming out of COVID, it's so important that we open up those networks again, which have been closed. And we do this with some degree of rationality, and we do it with some regard for the economic sort of consequences.
Yeah, thank you, Shanker. And we do have to wrap up now. So I just wanted to thank all of you. I know, Dr. Abla, you always have one more thing to say, but I'm going to ask you to wrap it in your final comments. COVID-19, this global pandemic has been hard on many, many people. So I like to end my webinars with a message of hope, especially when I have amazing experts like all of you that can share some ideas of what you're most hopeful about to the audience. So I would like to end my last question to each one of you. If there is one thing that you're extremely hopeful about as we hopefully emerge out of this global pandemic, what would that be? What would you share with the audience? Daniel, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. My main message would be, we are all connected, no matter how where you are located in a rural area, what your business is, how early your startup is. We all have perfect connections. My wife, she's a hobby knitter, and last time she did a pullover, she told me, I have the design from an old lady in New Zealand. I talked to her via a blog on WhatsApp, I don't know. So if my wife is able to get the design for her pullover from New Zealand, you as an entrepreneur, you can get so much knowledge from other places. You can work with incubators all over the world without having to be a tenant or even a citizen of that country. Let's use these networks and it will help the whole world to recover.
Lars?
I would say that trade is good. Trade is developing our economies, and trade is part of the recovery after COVID-19. And luckily, I see that trade is recovering quicker than we were expecting. So there are good times coming along, and we should all be a part of global trade.
Awesome. Shanker?
Yeah, I would say, building on both of those comments, actually, I would say that it's been, the COVID has been terrible. It's been very tough for a lot of people. But one of the things that has happened is it has transformed the way we interact with each other. And we could have done this a year ago. We could have had these sorts of events a year ago, but we wouldn't have. We would have had a physical conference at MIT's wonderful campus, and we would have all gone there. And that would have taken a certain amount of time, and it would have taken a certain amount of planning. We can do this kind of thing, and we can reach a much, much larger global audience. In a way, this sort of way of life, if you will, is it can be very democratizing, provided we deal with the issues of connectivity and so forth that are particularly applicable to developing countries. But it does allow the entrepreneur, it does allow the new entrant to a market a much more rapid way of getting to market than we've seen before. And I think we needed something dramatic in order to get both sides of the transaction to realize we can operate in this way, which we've known we could, before.
Thank you, Shanker. And Dr. Abla, I am biased because Dr. Abla has been an extremely inspirational power in my life. So I leave the last comment to you to share with everyone. What are you most hopeful about?
You're so sweet, Dina. First of all, I agree with what everybody said, okay? So, and I think what I hope for is that we don't forget what we have discovered during COVID-19. During COVID-19, we discovered that we need each other. We discovered that the poor are important and that excluding them does not make us succeed. So I hope we don't forget that as things get better. I also hope that governments appreciate entrepreneurs and appreciate young people, because entrepreneurship is coming from the young. And this is the point that I wanted to make before. You say, what should entrepreneurs do? It's not them. Governments need to be educated on the importance of entrepreneurs and the importance of giving them the information, telling them about the policies, and they need to be part of the lobbying and the pushing for the change of policies if we are to have a better world. We have seen things, we should not forget what we have seen, because seeing it and building and capitalizing on it is what's going to bring us a much better life.
Thank you, Dr. Abla, and thank you to all of you, and thank you to the audience for attending this webinar. I've learned a lot from all of you, and really deeply appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and expertise with the audience. And I do hope that you'll come back and do things with the Legatum Center again soon, in person or via Zoom. And we will be sharing the link to this amazing webinar on our social media, hopefully by tomorrow. So thank you all again. And for those of you who still have a long day ahead of you, have a great day. And for those of you who are in the late afternoon, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.